From the Youth Science Council, this is Good Question, a podcast about science in the UAE. I'm your host, Sada Shadbishi. With us on the show today is Dr. Aaron Bartholomew, biology professor at American University of Sharjah. Dr. Aaron is a passionate educator and researcher on marine ecology. We talk about darkling beetles, polychaetes, coral reefs, and what sounded like some really beautiful places to go birdwatching and fish spotting in the UAE. Thanks for being on the show, Dr. Aaron.
Hey, it's great to be here. I'm really excited about an opportunity to talk to you guys.
Awesome. Luckily, I know nothing about the topic we're discussing today, so we're really set for an interesting conversation. Can you give the audience an introduction about yourself and your academic and research interests?
Yeah, sure. Well, basically, when I was young, about 7, 8 years old, I decided that I wanted to make a big positive impact. And then my 8-year-old brain had to think of ways in which I could make an impact. And I decided that I wanted to make a positive impact in the world in marine biology. And so I studied hard in high school and ended up getting a half scholarship to go to University of Miami, which is arguably the best marine biology school on the East Coast of the U.S. So it was a good school. It's internationally renowned. And then I did really, really well there. And so I got a full scholarship to go to the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, which is part of the College of William and Mary in Virginia on the Chesapeake Bay. And they're a world-renowned institute when it comes particularly to coastal marine biology and especially estuaries, because the Chesapeake Bay is a major estuary where saltwater and freshwater mix there in the mid-Atlantic states. So I went there and studied predator-prey habitat or relationships. This is one of my main research focuses, and how complex habitats like coral reefs and seagrasses and mangroves, they provide refuge for prey from their predators, how basically the prey can hide out there. And after that, I had a postdoc. I went back to Miami because it's a great place, good beaches, fun people. I went back to Miami to the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is a government agency. And basically, I did work surveying coral reef fish up and down the Florida Keys. And these are some islands that are south of Florida. And basically, it was really cool. I got paid to scuba dive 5 times a day, hang out with some really, really cool people on a live-aboard boat. So we'd go diving during the day, we'd sleep on the boat at night, and we did that up and down the Florida Keys for a week and a half in my stretch anyways, which was one of the highlights of my career, actually. And then immediately after my postdoc, I came to American University of Sharjah here in the UAE, and I've been here since 2002. I've stayed some time, so that means I really, really like it. And while I've been here, I'm a teacher, but also a researcher. So I teach introductory biology, I teach ecology, I teach evolution and biodiversity. I teach a class in marine biology, which I'm offering this semester. I have some really interesting, enthusiastic students in that class. I'm taking them on some really, really cool trips around the UAE as well. And I taught an ichthyology class about fishes once, but maybe in the future I'll get to teach it again.
What is that again?
Ichthyology.
Ichthyology.
Ichthyology. So this is going into a whole lot of detail about fish, identifying the fish and talking all about their anatomy and their adaptations.
How was this student turnout for that one?
Well, we didn't have that many biology students at the time.
Yeah, okay.
Keep in mind.
Yeah.
And it's also a fairly specialized course.
I'm just
So
curious to know.
there was only 5 people that took that class.
Okay.
So it's
well,
a little
5
bit
fish enthusiasts.
right.
There's a lot of fish enthusiasts.
And you know what? Actually, 3 of those 5 people ended up using fish biology in their careers later on.
Wow.
One of them became head of biodiversity for the Abu Dhabi Environment Agency, so she's involved in fishes. One of them became a private consultant, so environmental consultant who ends up doing a lot of dives and surveying fish and these sort of things. And one of them got hired by an oil company to basically be the ecological manager of one of the islands that the oil company owns, to sort of make sure that they're not damaging the island too much and to take care of the natural habitat. And she uses fisheries and fish knowledge in her job too. So that was kind of surprising. So it seems to be a little bit too specialized for a smaller university.
Yeah, but
But
really
the
impactful.
majority of those students actually ended up using fish biology in their jobs in one way or another. So I was surprised at that. So maybe I should offer it again.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm interested in first talking about the definitions of some of the words that you mentioned. So, for
Sure.
example, what is the difference between marine biology and marine ecology?
Well, uh, marine ecology is a sort of a subdivision or a part of marine biology, I would say. So, in ecology in general, what you're doing is you're studying organisms and how they are affected by, and also how they affect their environment around them, which includes things like temperature and salinity, these sort of things, but also, of course, includes other species in their environment as well. So, ecology is a study of organisms and their relationship with those organisms and their environment includes other organisms as well. So, this is a subdiscipline within marine biology as a whole, which is studying the biology, the living organisms in the ocean and in estuarine environments as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah. What about corals and coral reefs? Are they the same thing or are they different?
Well, corals are the organism, and usually these corals are going to build a solid reef. So a coral is actually a really, really cool organism. It is actually two organisms in one that have a mutualistic relationship. And the mutualistic relationship, this means that both organisms benefit. So flowers and bees have a mutualistic relationship too, right? The bee is going to get nectar from the flower, and then the flower is going to get pollinated by the bee. So this is a mutualistic relationship. Both species help each other out. But with the corals, you have two organisms as well. So one of these organisms is referred to as a cnidarian, and the corals are kind of sort of related to jellyfish, which are also cnidarians. So the little corals, they do have stinging tentacles associated with them. They're not going to sting human beings, but they can sting smaller animals. So there's the animal cnidarian, and then living inside the tissue of the animal are the zooxanthellae, which are basically unicellular photosynthetic algae. So coral is two animals in one, and the algae photosynthesizes and creates food, and a lot of that food ends up providing energy to the animal. So some of these coral animals, they get the majority of their energy from the photosynthetic algae living inside their tissue. But then again, the corals, they're animals, and they are capturing smaller little zooplankton, which is little organisms floating around in the water with their stinging tentacles. And as animals, they are creating nitrogenous waste. So when you and I urinate, we're getting rid of nitrogenous waste. Well, this nitrogenous waste is a key nutrient that the algae need and is in short supply in tropical waters. So this is one part of the mutualism. There are other benefits the two species get from each other as well, but that's one of them. And these corals, as they're living and growing, they divide asexually, so they bud off and produce new little coral animals as they go. And as they're growing, they deposit calcium carbonate beneath them, and this is what the coral colony grows on. So if you walk along the beaches anywhere in the Emirates, you'll see pieces of coral washing up on the shore, and it's going to be white in color and oftentimes branching and with interesting patterns on it. But that is the calcium carbonate that was deposited by the living coral when it was alive, and this is the surface that it grows on, basically.
And I mean, I guess when we think of animals, we think of cats and dogs. I don't know what to expect a coral to look like, but I mean, does it move?
Yeah, oh yeah. It's going to move around. And if you think, you may be more familiar with things like sea anemones, for example. So if you think of like Finding Nemo and the clownfish lives in the anemone
Yeah.
that is sort of stuck on the rocks and has these waving tentacles. These are stinging tentacles again, kind of sort of
Yeah.
like a jellyfish. Well, if you think of a smaller version of a sea anemone, and then you think about, rather than just one of them, you think about thousands of them all sort of together in a colony, that's kind of what a coral is like. It's a colony of little tiny polyps, like tiny little sea anemones, all as part of the same colony with these photosynthetic algae inside them, photosynthesizing, but then also capturing prey floating by in the plankton and feeding on that as well.
I understand. And they're one of your primary research interests. Is that correct?
I have studied the corals
Yeah.
of Dubai. Yeah. So one of the research projects that I've been involved in has been studying corals as well as coral reef fish, the naturally occurring corals and coral reef fish in Dubai waters, principally out in Jebel Ali, but then also comparing those natural coral and coral reef fish communities with the corals and coral reef fish communities that end up settling on the breakwaters of these coastal development projects like the Palm Jumeirah, for example, or the Palm Jebel Ali. And I must say that I was not the principal researcher in that project. The main researcher that I was helping was my amazing friend and colleague, Dr. John Burt from NYU Abu Dhabi. He's really a superstar of marine biology in the Gulf. But I was fortunate enough to be involved with that project, and we got some really interesting results from those studies that we published.
Mm-hmm. And you've done work on artificial reefs and whether they can function um, and I'm quoting your publication, surrogates of natural habitats for corals and fish. Now, first of all, so coral reef fish are fish that live around the coral reefs. Is that?
Yeah, coral reef fish would be, I mean, some of the species also migrate into adjacent sand habitats. So around the coral, you have sand, you may have seagrass beds as well. So it's not that they're necessarily restricted to coral reefs. So those some species also spend almost all their time on coral reefs, but they may migrate into sandy areas, they may migrate into seagrass areas, they may migrate into adjacent mangrove habitats as well. But a coral reef fish is going to be one that's at least partially associated with coral habitats.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of them. They're very diverse.
Yeah. So, as in the case of many coastal areas here in the UAE and the rest of the Gulf, we've been relying for many years on marine life for our livelihood. So, our relationship would have naturally, with these ecosystems, would have naturally changed due to some factors. Do you think the prevalence of urban structures is one of them, or what else causes these
Right. Well, in the
changes in the
Gulf,
relationship?
I mean, the Gulf people have traditionally relied upon marine coastal areas for a variety of resources. Um, so, for example, of course, there's always been fishing, and there continues to be a lot of fishing in the Gulf as well. Everyone knows that in the Gulf, oil and natural gas is going to be the most important economic activity. But the second most important economic activity is going to be fishing, actually, and not everyone realizes that. So, this is economically very important to the Gulf. It is very important for the Gulf's traditions as well, and it's very important for Gulf nations' food security as well. I mean, living here in the UAE, a lot of our food is imported, but we do have native fisheries and can fish these fishery resources to support the UAE population with actual fish from the UAE as well. So fisheries is very important for UAE food security as well. But certainly they do fishing in the past. For example, if you look at some of the old structures in Ras Al Khaimah, for example, they would actually cut up coral blocks in order to build their houses, for example. Traditionally, they rely on mangroves, for example, as a fuel to cook with, but also to build their structures as well and build boats and these sort of things. Traditionally, they would hunt dugongs, actually.
Hunt
So,
what?
dugongs.
What are those?
Dugongs, these are basically sea cows. They're large marine mammals that live in UAE waters, and they graze on seagrasses. So, seagrasses, just like the name implies, these are small flowering plants, although they usually don't flower very often, but they are flowering plants, angiosperms, technically. But they are basically grasses or plants that have adapted to live in shallow marine waters and they're a great food for these dugongs, which graze upon them. But they're also going to support green sea turtles, which are going to eat these seagrasses as well. So the UAE likes to promote, sort of world records that Dubai does. And the UAE has some of the world's largest continuous stretches of seagrass in the world. So in the western Abu Dhabi waters, in between Abu Dhabi City and Qatar, there's just extensive shallow waters. And this is perfect habitat for seagrasses as well as corals. And because we have so much seagrass in the UAE, we have the world's second largest population of these dugong mammals behind Australia. So we're not number one, but we're number two when it comes to dugongs. And they're really, really cool animals. If you don't want to know what they are, just Google them, watch them on YouTube. They're big mammals grazing on seagrasses that move actually surprisingly fast. But these seagrass beds are also very important for turtles as well. We have big populations of green sea turtles that feed upon, these seagrass beds as well.
If people want to go see these dugongs, am I pronouncing that right?
Dugongs, yeah.
Dugongs?
Dugong, yeah.
Oh, dugongs.
Dugong.
If people want to go find them somewhere in the UAE, where would they go? Can you find them?
Well, I don't think I'd encourage that, actually. I don't know what the regulations are exactly, but I think it's one of these mammals that you're really not supposed to bother.
I see.
Yeah. And my guess is that they're fairly shy and would probably just try to swim away from you as well. But you have large populations of them in the seagrass beds west of Abu Dhabi, and they would be in shallow waters too.
Mm-hmm.
So you can potentially see them there.
Well, Hayat, who is our producer, just showed me an image, and I don't think... Oh, and there's also an image behind me in Dr. Aaron's office.
Yep, I have some posters of marine life on my wall.
Yeah.
So there's a dugong. I'm looking at it right over your shoulder.
Yeah, it's got a very interesting office. And it's filled with all sorts of pictures of animals that I can't really recognize. Yeah, interesting. I've never seen anything like that before, and I would not have expected that we would have them in our water here.
Yeah.
So besides these, besides coral reef fish and coral reefs, I also read that you work on darkling beetles and polychaetes. So they're two very different organisms, as I assume. Can you tell us what they are and why you study them, starting with darkling beetles, and how you developed into this very niche research interest?
Sure. Yeah. Well, in graduate school, I developed new ways of looking at habitat complexity and how prey species use complex habitat as a refuge to hide out from their predators. So if you sort of think in nature, where is it that you're going to find a lot of different animals? In many cases, particularly the small prey species, they're going to be hiding out in complex areas, hiding from their predators. So on land, you're going to find them in, stacks of leaves, for example, where they can hide out to an extent. You're going to find them in the bushes where they can hide out for a certain extent as well, because this provides them with refuge from their predation. You're not going to find them running around in the open, because then predators like hawks or cats or foxes can find them and catch them really, really easily. Instead, they're going to be in little burrows and in vegetation, for example. Well, it's the same thing underwater. So complex habitats in marine habitats would include things like mangrove forests, would include things like coral reefs and seagrass beds as well. So one of the things that I was interested in, that I'm proud of in my research career, is I developed some new ways of measuring habitat complexity and how it functions as a refuge for prey from their predators. And some of the ideas that I developed, I feel, are sort of universally applicable. So in graduate school and here at AUS, I tested some of these ideas using marine organisms, fish and small crustaceans, which are related to crabs and shrimp, for example.
Yeah.
And then I used some freshwater species as well. And then I use these darkling beetles to test some of my habitat complexity ideas using terrestrial species as well. And so if I have these ideas, which I think are universally applicable, it's important they apply to a variety of habitats and complex habitats in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial environments. And so I got into working with darkling beetles to test these
On or
ideas.
with?
What's that?
Are they your calling on or with?
Oh yeah, well, with them, yeah. So it's funny. I made these like little artificial structures mimicking vegetation, and I put them out in the desert. And then I had some ideas about how this would affect the beetles that would colonize these structures, that would use them as habitats, and it worked out really well. And the cool thing is that I was able to do this with some undergraduate students. So I got published with 2 undergraduate students on this project. They didn't end up pursuing ecology. One of them's now getting her doctorate in pharmacology, I believe, nothing related to beetles. And the other one is working in health science, actually, at Sharjah University. So again, nothing related to beetles.
Yeah.
But they were great. It was wonderful working with them, and I was so happy to involve undergraduate students in my research. And in general, if you are coming out of your undergraduate degree with publications, this is just so attractive to people that want to take you in as a master's student, or people that want to give you a job. So I was happy to help them out, and they really helped me out with my research too.
These beetles, are they a water-based species or
Oh, they're
both?
they're extreme
Land
desert. Yeah.
Oh, desert.
Desert.
Yeah.
So if you walk around in the deserts, particularly at nighttime, because they come out at night. But even if you're walking around in the daytime and you sort of flip over some dead logs or poke about in the vegetation, do it a little carefully, because we do have snakes and scorpions. But if you do it carefully, oftentimes you'll see these little black beetles scurrying around. And in some cases, they're quite big black beetles, actually.
Right, okay.
So don't be scared of them. They're not going to hurt you. You can pick them up, actually.
Yeah.
And I give them to my little girls and have them hold these darkling beetles. And they say, well, yeah, first. They're a little bit, but I said, hey, don't worry about it. They're harmless, all right? It's all cool.
My dad's never made me do that.
Yeah. Well, I want strong girls that are cool naturalists that aren't going to be like, oh, spiders, or I want them to.
And
I want them to pick up some.
And boys, you should see how my brother responds to cockroaches and other types of insects.
Right.
I do a lot better with them. I mean, I'm not their biggest fans, but I'm usually the person to call for when there's a cockroach situation.
That's great.
And that's not often, by the way. Don't think we've got an infestation at home.
Right. So ideally, I want my little girls to be able to like pick up beetles and pick up spiders, as long as they're not the poisonous variety, and to be able to know the difference between the poisonous and non-poisonous, so they know what they can pick up.
That's really useful from Dad. So I actually think I held one before, a very large one at
Is this a beetle you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah.
City Walk. They've got
okay.
this what is it? It's like
right, the indoor rainforest thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was cool. I went there. I enjoyed that.
I went there and I held one of these beetles and I was stroking them. I think it's a beetle species and it's really large.
They can, the beetles
like
can
it was
be
my
pretty big.
the size of my hand.
Yeah, so we're talking maybe 2.5, 3 centimeters long in some cases.
Yeah.
But again, if you poke around in the desert, particularly if you go out at night or dusk or dawn, you'll see these things running around, and they're quite diverse, and they're really, really interesting. They just look like a black beetle, but the more you study them, as any subject or any animal, the more you study them, the more interesting they become. And I went from studying them for the purpose of habitat complexity to then move on to studying them and how they depend upon desert vegetation. So they're certainly going to be more prevalent in these desert shrubs we have compared with walking around out in the open. And I wanted to know why. And based on the studies that I also did with different undergraduate students, the main reason is that they use this vegetation as a refuge from extreme temperatures. And in fact, if they're caught out in the open too long, they can actually die within a matter of minutes. So they go into vegetation in order to regulate their body temperature. And they have to regulate their body temperature not only for the beetle itself, but also they have little microorganisms, unicellular organisms inside their gut that digest the wood that they eat. So they tend to eat dead plant matter, dead leaves, and dead sticks, for example. But the beetle can't digest that themselves, just like you and I can't chew on a stick and get any nutrition out of that. But they do have microorganisms inside their gut that can digest that wood material. And they have to regulate their body temperature for the digestive ability of those microorganisms also. So it's some interesting things going on with temperature regulation and vegetation. And then what some research that I want to get into is to use beetles as a way of talking about the importance of vegetation for UAE deserts as a whole.
Yeah.
And really, if you go dune bashing or you go out into deserts in the UAE, in many cases, you don't see that many plants. And you think, oh, well, that's normal. It's a desert. Of course, you're not going to see many plants. It doesn't rain very much. But actually, the reason that you don't see so many plants, and in some cases see very few plants at all, is actually a lot of that is due to overgrazing by camels, in fact. So, near campus here at American University of Sharjah and elsewhere in the Emirates, there are little patches of deserts that camels and goats can't get to. And I use one of these patches for my own research, but also to educate my ecology students. So there's a little patch of desert nearby here that is surrounded by housing developments and highways, but it's an open patch of desert that camels and goats can't get to. And the amount of vegetation there is much more extensive than what you see out in the open desert. And what's the difference? No camels and goats means more vegetation. More vegetation means more lizards, more snakes, more spiders, more beetles, more foxes and animals. And this little patch of desert, you tour around there and you see maybe 15, 20 fox burrows in this little area, red fox burrows that are living there. Here, yeah, right on campus. And I mean, I show my students this, and there's some evidence that they're raiding the local trash because you see like little cut up chicken bones and biryani bones by their burrow and trash every once in a while.
Yeah.
But a lot of desert foxes. And so the overall point is, without so much camel overgrazing and in some cases goat overgrazing, you have more vegetation, which supports more natural wildlife, more than you'd expect. And another way you can experience this, if you pay attention, is if you're driving along 311 or 611, outside of the city, you notice they have those camel fences by the road.
Yeah.
And of course, the camel fences are there to prevent the camels from wandering into traffic and causing a huge accident. But if you compare the vegetation near the road where the camels can't get to it with the vegetation just on the other side of the fence, you see a stark difference. And what that shows you is that some parts of the desert are bare, not because of lack of water, but are bare because of camel overgrazing. We have some plants that are amazingly adapted to desert life and can still grow and thrive under low rain conditions, either because they're very well adapted or because they have deep roots that can penetrate into the groundwater. But these plants are overgrazed in some cases. And so in some areas, the only plants you see in any abundance are plants that are poisonous, that camels can't eat. And the other plants that are edible are much more sparse as a result. So this is something interesting that Abu Dhabi Environment Agency is doing. I recently went with an alumnus who is working for them in the biodiversity division. And basically, she showed me some desert areas that were, far away in the western part of the country, so not many people go there. But they're basically fenced off from camel grazing. And you look outside the fence and you see practically no plants whatsoever and no additional wildlife as well. And then you go inside the enclosure where camels are excluded, and there's little shrubs everywhere and little grasses everywhere. And you see more butterflies and you see beetle tracks all over the place. You see rodent tracks like jerboas, which are sort of like jumping little mice everywhere. You see rabbit tracks everywhere. You see more birds and butterflies. It's just amazing what the desert could be without too much overgrazing of camels. So I'd like to use desert beetles as a way of talking about vegetation promotes biodiversity. And this is important to preserve vegetation to promote a more natural biodiversity in the desert as well.
I love how it's so different for, I mean, first of all, we got to thank the camels for the lack of snakes in the deserts, but also it's kind of, I don't know, I guess it's also kind of sad for them, sad for them because they no longer have the kind of ecosystem that facilitates their survival and their presence in that area. And it really is interesting to see how one thing that changes within an ecosystem can really spiral into just all these sort of changes that impact all these sort of species across the spectrum. I mean, good for camels, but bad for all these other species you
Right.
mentioned.
And certainly, no, I mean, camels are traditionally a part of the natural ecosystem on the Arabian Peninsula as well. And people in the Emirates love their camels. I love to see the camels wandering around the desert too. And certainly we're not saying, you need to dramatically decrease the amount of camels, but maybe preserve more
I
more
understand.
areas where there's less camel grazing and give the chance to other organisms to thrive more in
Yeah.
the desert and get a look at what our desert could be. If you see these areas where camels are excluded, you say, wow, this is what the desert is supposed to look like more. And you find such a greater variety of life and green things blooming where you look
Yeah.
outside of the fence and it's just sand dunes,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Okay, let's get to the polychaetes. I gotta,
Polychaetes.
I gotta admit, I practiced on that one.
Yeah, extra bonus to anyone that actually knows what a polychaete is.
Well, I was referring to the pronunciation.
Yeah. So
It's the first
polychaetes,
step.
they're related to earthworms. So they are annelid worms, which are segmented worms. And polychaetes, most of them, however, live in marine waters and marine sediments. And they're just really diverse and interesting in terms of some of the adaptations they have and the variety of things that different species can do. All right. And I would say with polychaetes specifically, but small invertebrates in general, the more you look into them, the more you just see, wow, that's a really bizarre organism. And some of these polychaetes that are predatory polychaetes, for example, if Hollywood thought them up and made them giant in size, they would be scarier and more bizarre than anything
Godzilla.
that Hollywood could come up with.
Yeah.
So there's species of polychaetes, for example, that have the ability to basically stick out their part of their stomach, and they have these nasty little hooks on the end. And again, if you think about this from a Hollywood perspective, basically imagine a giant worm if you're something that this polychaete eats and it's far away from you, and then all of a sudden it everts its throat with these nasty hooks on it, grabs you, and then sucks you immediately right inside its body. I mean, this is a great horror movie monster.
Or a Spider-Man villain.
Right. But no one has heard of this because they're only 7 centimeters long. And of course, they're not scary. They look just like a worm, but you know what they do. And if they were big,
Yeah.
they would be terrifying. Okay.
Yeah.
And they're really cool. And I've held these particular species in my hand, and they've actually tried to bite me. And one of them drew blood. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's so cute. You're such a ferocious predator. Right. But yeah, these polychaetes, they're marine worms.
What do they feed on?
It depends on the species, again, and they do a lot of different things depending on what species they are. So some of them, as I say, are nasty, vicious predators if you're small in size. Other ones are grazing on algae, for example. Other ones are burrowing in the mud and feeding on food particles in the mud. And there are some that make sort of beautiful ice cream shaped sort of structures around themselves. They're called ice cream worms because they glue individual sand grains together,
Mm-hmm.
and they're burrowed beneath the sediment, feeding on organic matter in the sediments themselves. And then there are some that are attached to rocks and are basically filter feeders. And probably the only polychaetes a regular person may see locally would be some of these tube worms that attach to rocks and are exposed at low tide. So if you're walking around the Emirates beaches at a hotel, for example, and they have some rocks as a breakwater and you're there at low tide, you'll see these little tiny white spirals attached to the rocks. And those are polychaete worms inside their tubes, and they're filter feeders. When the tide rises, they actually create mucus net that they catch plankton in order to feed on. So those are probably the only polychaetes regular people will ever see. But if you go ahead and look at the benthos and the bottom of the ocean, and if you take a scoop of mud there, you'll see a bunch more polychaetes as well. So they're fascinating little creatures, and again, they may be small in size, but if you look at them closely, they're really weird, wonderful little organisms like invertebrates are as a whole. I mean, vertebrates to me are not as interesting because we're all familiar with vertebrates. We know people in our lives, and a lot of the vertebrates
You're
are.
saying this to a psychologist.
A lot of vertebrates are
I
more.
beg to differ.
Yeah, a lot of
I
vertebrates.
like
Well,
the
biologically,
vertebrates.
not in terms of brain. Of course,
Yeah, I
humans
know.
are definitely going to have the most
Yeah.
complex, interesting behavior. Some
Yeah.
of which is baffling to everyone. But in terms of like just weird creatures that are very different from us,
Mm.
you got to study the invertebrates because there's a lot of strange, interesting adaptations they have, and not a lot of people get into them just because they're small in size.
Mm.
But don't let that stop you. Study these invertebrates, and you look at their adaptations and some of the things they can do, and you're just like, wow, that's crazy. And Hollywood couldn't invent what some of these creatures can actually do.
I remember an excerpt I once read from Darwin talking about a predatorial wasp
Right.
that does some really bizarre things
Oh, wow. Yeah.
in terms of how it treats its prey.
Right. Oh, yeah. I know a couple. Go ahead. Give me your example, and I can talk
don't
about it too.
remember what
Yeah.
it's called, but I remember reading the excerpt and being so traumatized because I remember something about how when it like either feeds on them or rests its babies in them, they grow
Oh,
in
yeah.
their prey.
Oh, scary
And-
stuff. Yeah, if you're a prey. Yeah.
And then the prey would still be alive as
Yep.
something is growing within it and feeding on it.
Yeah.
And that would be for the rest of its tiny and poor existence. And I remember
Exactly.
reading this and thinking,
Scary
God.
stuff. That's horrible.
and
Again,
he expresses some serious concerns about it and about the state of the universe as a result by thinking, well, we've got these really terrifying predatorial wasps that do something like this, and I can't imagine why something like that exists, you know?
well, yeah, it's sort of the hippy dippy view of ecology, which is to say, the birds and the butterflies and the bees and the flowers, they all get along so well in harmony, and there's nature's balance, and it's peace and love and happiness. And they say, oh, wouldn't it be great if humans were more like that? And actually, nature is red in tooth and claw, red for blood. It is brutal. Nature is brutal basically. And so, these wasps are a good example of this. It's something straight out of the movie Aliens.
Yeah, they're parasitic wasps.
Yeah, they're parasitoid wasps,
Yeah.
which are sort of
Parasitoid.
between being predatory and being a parasite.
Yeah.
And a good example of
remember.
this, if you watch nature documentaries, I watched a lot of nature documentaries as a kid, and this helped inspire me to become an ecologist. But for example, there are species of wasps that will basically paralyze a tarantula, being a very, very large spider, as an example. I believe it was a tarantula, but a very large spider. And then they will have an ovipositor, which is a long, hollow tube that the females use to lay their eggs inside the spider.
Yeah.
And then
I
the
think
eggs
that's the one.
the eggs will hatch into larvae, and
Yeah.
the spider is still alive but
Yeah.
paralyzed. and the eggs will eat the spider, or sorry, the larvae, I should say. The eggs hatch into larvae, and the larvae will eat the spider from within while the spider
Yeah.
is still alive, and this is how they grow and mature. And there's many examples of wasps that will basically lay eggs inside of organisms like caterpillars, as another example, and then the larvae hatch and eat their host from within. And again, this is something straight out of Aliens. Imagine like this alien
Yeah.
inside
Yeah.
the human body
I've seen the
and then
photos.
bursting. I saw that movie way too young. I had nightmares for quite some time afterwards.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
just like that, they're basically growing inside their
Yeah.
host.
So, for people who are interested in doing what you do today and they want to follow in your footsteps, um, how would they recommend they start? And maybe if you could give us some introductory resources, maybe if they don't want to go with the full fledged career, what would they be looking into first? And if they do want to go into the full fledged career, what would you recommend? But let's start with some introductory
Well,
resources.
first of all, I would say we need more people to go into conservation biology and ecology here in the Gulf region. It's a fascinating region to work in because the organisms we have locally are adapted to extreme conditions. If you're talking about terrestrial life, it's extreme temperatures and extreme dryness. It's a desert environment that's pretty brutal, and the fact that plants and animals can live in this environment is amazing. That itself is worth studying more. And then in marine environments, as I mentioned, there's extreme temperatures, extreme salinities, extreme temperature changes. So in a day's time, you can go from very hot to very cold temperatures. These organisms that live in marine waters have to be able to adapt to that as well. But honestly, I would say even better than reading about our natural environments, go ahead and visit some of the amazing places we have here in the Emirates and also in the area in Oman, for example. So there are people that are offering kayaking tours in the mangrove forests of Abu Dhabi. If you go on one of these kayaking tours, you'll see the beautiful mangroves themselves. You'll see a lot of really amazing wading birds living amongst the mangroves. You'll see a lot of fish and potentially crabs and other invertebrates using the mangrove habitats as well. Go ahead and take a mangrove trip and be inspired by the beauty of the nature that you see there. You can, for example, go bird watching in Ras Al Khor in Dubai. So there are bird watching areas set up. Take your binoculars out there and see the flamingos, see the mangroves, but also see the other birds that are there in Ras Al Khor. Visit the Sharjah Aquarium if you want an indoor nice trip with your kids. So the Sharjah Aquarium, actually, there's a museum next to it, which is the Maritime History Museum. So you can visit both museums on the same day. And the Sharjah Aquarium is really cool in that the species that are in the Sharjah Aquarium are local species. So if you want to see local species, but you don't want to go snorkeling or diving yourself, you can go there, spend a day there. There's some nice restaurants nearby. There's a little playground. If you have small kids, they can play there too. Go and see Al Quwain Lagoon. So not many people visit Al Quwain, but Al Quwain Lagoon is one of the most beautiful natural areas in the Northern Emirates and potentially in the country as a whole. And it's a pity that more people don't visit it because it's a really great natural area. So there is the Flamingo Beach Hotel, for example, where you can rent and go on a boat trip for about an hour. And the Flamingo Beach itself, it's a nice, funky hotel, but don't expect it to be 5-star. It's a little rundown, but it's got character, so to speak. Right? But they have boats and they'll take you out into
Vintage.
the Al Quwain Lagoon
Mhm.
and you'll see flocks of flamingos feeding. So again, bring your binoculars. You'll see the flamingos. You'll see these wading water birds that are catching fish. For example, various herons are there. For example, you'll almost certainly see sea turtles there. So there's a lot of seagrass habitat there. As you're on this boat trip, you'll see sea turtles coming up to breathe. In some cases, you'll see them swimming right next to your boat. So usually swimming away from the boat, but they're a little scared. You'll see small little patches of coral potentially. On the beach itself, it's a small little beach, but right off the beach, there's a beautiful seagrass bed, and I take my students there. In fact, soon we're going on this boat trip, and we're going to take little goggles and masks so we can dive down and see the seagrasses and see all the fish and the cool invertebrates in this seagrass bed as well. And then if you're interested, drive up to the Musandam Peninsula and visit Kasab, Oman. So there, you and your friends can rent a dhow and go on a dhow trip through the fjords of the Musandam Peninsula, and they'll serve you some nice food on board, and they'll give you snorkeling equipment. You can dive into the water and see some beautiful corals and beautiful coral reef fish. Musandam Peninsula has some of the best, most beautiful coral and reef fish in the Gulf area. And then the cool thing about that is that every single time I've done this trip, the Indo-Pacific humpback dolphins will follow your dhow. Basically, they'll be riding the wake right next to the dhow. You'll have mothers with their babies right there. You can look down at them. They're right below you on the boat. And this is a really incredible experience for kids especially, but also for adults as well. So see Kasab. On the East Coast, there's some great little spots that you can either go snorkeling or diving. So there's hotels you can visit on the East Coast where you can go snorkeling on Dibba Rock. It's a little bit offshore, so the hotel has to bring you out there in a little boat. But then once you're there, you jump in the water, you see beautiful corals, you see beautiful coral reef fish. Oftentimes you see blacktip reef sharks, which don't worry, don't be scared. They're not gonna hurt you. So if you've wanted to see a shark in your life, but you never have, go to some of these snorkeling spots on the east coast of the UAE. There's a good chance you may see some blacktip reef sharks, which are cool little sharks to see. I took my girls out there actually snorkeling on my back, and I saw a shark with one of my girls on my back, and I said, "Shark, shark!" And my girl's first instinct, of course, is to be scared and to grab onto me. And I'm like, no, look in the water. And I'm sort of pushing her head down, realizing that this isn't necessarily appropriate, but I knew that she would want to see the shark and brag about it to her friends later. So I'm like, "Shark, shark, no, look at the shark. Really, it's right there." And she's, "Oh yeah, I see it." And then, of course, she was able to tell all her friends that she saw a shark on her dad's back. But the other place actually where that took place, where I took her, and I go all the time, it's like one of my favorite places on the whole planet, actually, is a Sandy Beach Hotel. It's a place called Snoopy Rock. And really, they should give me a commission because I've recommended this to all of my friends over the years.
Yeah.
They pay me some sort of commission. But it's a great little spot, cool little beach resort. And maybe about 100 meters offshore is Snoopy Rock. And on either side of Snoopy Rock, again, there's beautiful coral reef fish. If you know where to look and you sort of stay in one place quietly in shallow waters, you will see these blacktip reef sharks cruising by. And about maybe 25% of the times, I also manage to see sea turtles there. I almost always see cuttlefish, which are sort of related to squid, basically. So you see these cuttlefish there. And again, some really, really beautiful fish as well. And if you're a scuba diver, there's a variety of places you can go scuba diving on the East Coast too. And then in Eastern Oman, if you want to travel a little further, there are tours that you can arrange to see sea turtles laying their eggs. And if you come back a little bit later, you can see the eggs hatching and the little baby turtles running into the water. So this is a really amazing thing to see as well. So the east coast of Oman is an important sea turtle hatching area for several species. And there are tours you can arrange to see this. And I guess the reason I point this out is that reading about the marine environment is certainly interesting. But actually experiencing the local marine environment can be amazing. And really, there's a lot more interesting marine life and marine habitats to visit than you might think. And if you go out there and see these beautiful marine habitats, then people say, "That's amazing, that's beautiful." And then they start to care about that environment. And they want to learn more about that environment, and they want to preserve that environment as well. And so when people see the beauty that we have in the marine environment and also in the terrestrial environment, but I'm a marine biologist, so I'm more interested in the marine environment. When they see this beauty, they want to learn more about it and they want to preserve it as well. And in fact, people visiting these marine environments supports ecotourism efforts, and then people are more likely to preserve these habitats as well. And I'm surprised, for example, that there's so little ecotourism activity in this Al Quwain lagoon that I mentioned. It's just one hotel with a guy in a boat that brings people out, but it's such a beautiful afternoon that you can spend there, and again, seeing flamingos and sea turtles and fish even, and it's beautiful. So I think if people see this, they'll be impressed and they'll be more motivated to preserve this and tell
Yeah.
their friends.
Yeah. You're a really fascinating person, Dr. Aaron, and I really appreciate you coming. Well, we came to you this time, but I really appreciate this conversation and the opportunity you gave us to talk to you. And I guess this concludes our discussion, although I suspect there's a lot more to talk about as usual. But thank you so much for
Well,
being on the show.
thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I'm always happy to talk about the marine environments in the UAE. There's a lot out there that's really interesting to look at, and a lot of beauty out there to see. And I encourage you to go out and your listeners to go out and see it. It's
And
really beautiful stuff.
And thank you for educating us on all of this. Yeah. That was Dr. Aaron Bartholomew, biology professor at American University of Sharjah. To listen to more episodes, you can find Good Question on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for what you'd like to see from us next, you can reach us at GoodQuestionUAE on Instagram and Twitter, or email us at info@goodquestion.ae. Good Question is a production of the Youth Science Council and the Office of Advanced Sciences in the United Arab Emirates. Produced and directed by Hind Al Ali and Hayat Al Hassan. Sound designed by Gareth Chen. Sara Al Ali is our editor. Our social media and communications are managed by Mohammed Al Mansouri and Fatma Lutah. And I'm Sara Shirbaji.